Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and I have a keen interest in ethics, the history of ethics, and I have a great guest here today to talk to us about the history of ethics. She's a professor emerita at the University of Regina and was formerly the Canada Research Chair in Social Justice. She has been a regular op ed contributor to Free Inquiry since 2003, and she has authored numerous books, including Aquinas and Modernity, The Lost Promise of Natural Law. Shadia Drury, welcome to the show.
Hi.
I hope I pronounced that right. I always forget how to pronounce the name before I
Oh
start.
no, it's very good.
Okay, so what is ethics and how does it relate to morality?
Yeah, I mean that takes us into heavy waters right away because the English language doesn't really have is not subtle enough to give us that distinction between ethics and morality because in the English language they're synonyms, really. There's no difference. But if you go into German, for example, you get a difference. For example, Hegel talks about the difference between Moralität and Sittlichkeit. And Sittlichkeit is a morality, or a morality that fits a particular society, the morality of a particular society, a particular culture. It is situated in a particular place and time, whereas moralitat for him is universal, it's global. And he thinks that the shift between Sittlichkeit and Moralität is what progress, human progress, has been about. So the history of ethics is also the history of humanity and the history of the progress of humanity for Hegel. And he thinks that Socrates played a very pivotal role in this history because he thinks that Socrates discovered what he calls an I deep in his soul that was not a personal I, but a universal I. And, and this I was um, was a universal standard that applied to all humanity. So in a way, Socrates was instrumental in the forwarding humanity towards a higher standard. Of course, it's all bullshit, It's complete rubbish, but it's part of the self understanding of the West for the most part. That's why my most recent book is called Chauvinism of the West. It's this understanding that in conquering and overtaking and spreading their culture around and all of their imperialism, they're civilizing the world. They're advancing the progress of humanity. It's sort of a really a certain self-aggrandizement involved in it. But nevertheless, I mean, Hegel is very, very perceptive because he says that what is dangerous about this global morality is somehow it tends to get mired in very dark stuff. So every time there is this universal morality that emerges and pushes us forward, it also gets mired in horrors. So right at the beginning, the story of Socrates itself is a story of how he corrupted his students and why he was accused of corrupting the young, of inventing new gods and of corrupting the young. That was the charge. But of course, Plato made this absolutely fascinating legend around him, a legend that he was innocent, that he was an inspired man, divinely inspired man, and he was falsely accused and put to death. And and this legend has survived and has survived precisely because it kind of mirrors the legend of Jesus, another very um, divinely inspired man who was innocent and accused and put to death. But in general, I mean, the success of Plato and Socrates as the bearers of Western civilization, their success has everything to do with the triumph of Christianity, because the new religion that Socrates was converted to was Orphism, and it was very much mirroring Christianity. But to get back to the story of Hegel, Hegel says that every time there is this great advance, there is also a backtracking and some horrible things. So Socrates represents a great advance. The French Revolution presents another, but they all end in disaster. Socrates ends in disaster because his students, Critias, Charmides, and Alcibiades, they were involved in the worst atrocities in the history of Athens. So at the end of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens, they were instrumental during the Peloponnesian Wars, they were instrumental in the defeat of Athens at the hands of Sparta. And when Athens lost the Peloponnesian Wars, when Sparta won the Peloponnesian Wars, um, Sparta decided to put 30 people in charge of Athens and to create a new constitution for Athens. That's in 404 BCE. And those 30 people became the notorious 30 tyrants who created a reign of terror that was the darkest in Athenian history. And according to the historians, Thucydides and Xenophon and even Aristotle tell us that they just massacred people. There was all sorts of extrajudicial killings, and 1,500 people in Athens. That's a lot, given the size of Athens. 1,500 people were massacred, killed. Some of them just because they were Democrats, others just because they were rich, and eventually, I mean, Sparta, who was no friend of Athenian democracy, was so repulsed by the whole thing, by the horror of that regime, that she invited the the Democrats to come back to Athens and to sing to Athena and to reconstitute their democracy. So that was, and then of course Socrates was still sitting there after all of that, and so the newly constituted democracy brought him to trial. And because he was the student of Critias, Charmides, and Alcibiades, and these people, they appear in all of Plato's dialogues, and not a word is said about the horrors they inflicted on Athens. Some of the dialogues even bear their names. There's the Charmides, there's the Critias, and of course the Alcibiades. But and their relationship with Socrates was very intimate. But what the Athenians wanted is for Socrates to get out of town, so he's not corrupting any more people, any more young oligarchs, and he wouldn't get out of town. I mean, if he just got out of town, there would have been no trial and nothing would happen to him. He could go and live in any one of the other oligarchic cities with all his oligarchic friends in other states, but he wouldn't. He stood his ground and decided that he was totally innocent, and he wanted to martyr himself. I mean, even Xenophon admits that he wanted to martyr himself so he can go down in glory as being a guy that stood for a transcendent truth of some sort. But he wasn't just accused because he was the teacher of Critias and Alcibiades. He was also accused um, because he invented new gods. He didn't invent the new gods, but that's what the charge against him. He was accused of impiety, which meant inventing new gods, and the other charge was corrupting the young. The two charges were related, but both Socrates and Plato had converted to a new mystery religion called Orphism, and that had a lot to do with that charge of impiety. Mhm.
Would it be fair to say that ethics is the discipline that studies and elucidates how we ought to behave, the values that we ought to pursue?
Yeah, exactly. Uh,
So
yeah,
before Socrates, we had we didn't have them, but there were the Sophists in
yes,
Greece. What was their perspective on ethics?
Well, the word sophist itself means wise men. But in the hands of Plato, they became transformed into wise guys. Plato didn't like them, and I don't blame him. Actually, they were cynics, but they were also simpletons. So the debate between Socrates and the sophists, to my mind, is not quite as interesting as what's at issue between Socrates and the whole Homeric tradition that came before. But the sophists basically, the way they're presented in Plato, much of what we know about them, we know through Plato. And the way they're presented in Plato, Thrasymachus, for example, he tries to answer the question, what is right? What is righteousness? What is virtue? What is morality, basically? How do we live a moral life? And his answer basically is that what we call justice or righteousness is simply the interest of the stronger. And so it's the strong, they make the rules, and we call it justice. It's all a sham. And it's, of course, that view is very contemporary now. It's reflected in the postmodern idea that justice is whatever we call justice, or even truth, is a matter of power, and that's all it is. And we might think this is the truth, the true and the good, but the true and the good are just defined by those in power. That's all there is to it. And the sophists had to enlarge on that. I mean, in book 2 of Plato's Republic, he enlarges on that, on what Thrasymachus had to say about justice as the advantage of the stronger, because how did it come into being in the first place? So they imagine a kind of state of nature before there was any civil society or civil order. And in that state of nature, there were the strong and there were the weak. The strong did as they pleased, and the weak suffered the consequences. And they're trying to answer the question of how is it that even in civil society, how can you have a democratic state like the Athenian state, which had a lot of freedom? We can discuss what is right and what is wrong. We can disagree about truth and falsehood. We can criticize the government. We can criticize the gods. How do we get there? And obviously it can't be just the interest of the stronger, because this society is organized for the interest of the many, not for the interest of the few. So so the answer to that has to do with the state of nature, is how they saw it. So this, in the state of nature, there was the strong and then there was the weak, and the weak got tired of being preyed upon by the strong all the time. So what they do is they get together and they pool their resources, so to speak, and um, confront the weak and create rules that limit the freedom of the strong, and create laws and create a society, and they call it justice. So it's still the advantage of the stronger, but now the stronger are the more numerous, are the weak in their collective strength, kind of thing. And so either way, it's the justice or virtue or ethics is a matter of power again. Uh, and Plato's answer to that is completely different. But because at least the sophists were still in a world where ethics was about relations with others. Plato and Socrates went to a completely different world where ethics was relation not with others, but with oneself. It's about the order of the psyche. That's what ethics was. And control of reason over the appetites, control of the divine part of the soul, because they believe, because of their conversion to Orphism, which was a mystery religion. The mystery religion believed that the soul was divine, is the divine part of, is connected to the divine, and therefore is deathless and immortal. And and that the body was just prison of the soul. And the whole project of ethics, the whole project of the moral life is the escape of the soul from entrapment in the body, which was very otherworldly and very shocking to the pagans, because the pagans believed that there was a very radical difference between the immortals and the mortals. We are the mortals. We're creatures of a season. We're here today, gone tomorrow. We're um, we're we're very different from immortals. So the idea that human beings had an immortal soul, that was shocking, shocking innovation. Yeah.
In reading Plato, and I haven't by any means read everything he's written, but I have read The Republic, Phaedo, Credo, The Apology, and a few other works. And I've listened to lectures given about Plato. It doesn't seem like Plato has an elaborate system of ethics in the way that Aristotle does. Like, he doesn't come out and say this is how you ought to behave. It's more was Socrates asking questions of people around him, seeing if they could prove what they believed.
Mhm.
Did
Um,
Plato anywhere that I'm unaware of elucidate a system of ethics?
it wasn't a system so much, because there's so much mystery in it for his from his understanding. If the goal is the liberation of the soul from entrapment in the body, which continued to be his view right at the very end, and when he's writing about the laws, for the most part, in the laws, the idea that somehow the early Socrates and the late Plato's are two different people is completely wrong as far as I'm concerned. If we look at Plato's Laws, his last kind of magnum opus, where he describes how a society has got to be organized, and so that people can reach their moral goal, which is a kind of supernatural goal of salvation of some sort. That morality for Plato, for ordinary people, was very low level. And the low level is what you can do for yourself. And that is to control your appetites. That's something in your capacity. Control the bodily appetites, because they will ruin your life and certainly will destroy your soul. So if the soul is going to escape from the body, if we want to put it that way, if the soul is going to be redeemed in in any way, then you need more than just your own ability for self-control. You need what Socrates said is a physician of the soul. And he thought of himself as a physician of the soul. And he thought that the ultimate political art is that of a physician of the soul. And he compared the political statement, the statesman, with the physician. But he also had a very perverse idea of what the physician was. The physician knows best what's good for you. So if the physician says your arm should be cut off because it has gangrene and you're going to die, then your arm should be cut off. If you don't want it cut off, the physician has the right to cut it off for you, for your own interests, which is a very perverse view of what the the physician is, and the statesman is being compared to the physician. So this is why Socrates has a Plato in his book, The Statesman, in his dialogue, The Statesman. He has a very hard time distinguishing between the statesman and the tyrant, and that's so it's not surprising that his students became tyrants, because they felt they were physicians of the soul. They knew what was good for Athens. They knew that they had to destroy all of her enemies, and her enemies were all the Democrats, had to be destroyed if she was to be saved. And ultimately, the vision of the state that Plato and Socrates imagined is not unlike something like the Ayatollah Khomeini's vision of the state. It's all organized so that it's possible to save your soul. Mhm.
So Plato's most famous student is Aristotle. And Aristotle does put forth a system of ethics in his book. I pronounce it Nicomachean Ethics. I don't know how to pronounce
Nicomachean.
it.
Nicomachean X. Yeah.
So, what does Aristotle teach regarding ethics?
He teaches that ethics is about how to live well in this world. It's really not, it's about relations with others and how to live well in this world. He wasn't, he was more of a pragmatic kind of guy. And Ethics was he was closer, I would say, to kind of the Greek way of thinking. His focus was more in this world, in this life, even though he thought there was a divine principle that kind of governed the world. But I haven't delved deeply into his metaphysics. But his ethics, he did think of ethics as eudaimonia. Eudaimonia meaning thriving in this world, fulfillment, self-fulfillment, happiness, and that sense of completion, and that relations with others, and especially friendship, were very, very important to him in that light. So you have to cultivate the virtues that also Plato and Socrates outline, namely a wisdom, temperance, um, courage, and justice. Yeah.
So, whereas with Plato, you have sort of an otherworldly ethics, right? Even in his epistemology, you know the good because of the form of good that's in another
Mm-hmm.
world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's about giving up bodily desires, much in the same way that Christianity teaches to hate the flesh for the love of God, that sort of thing. But with
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle, we have more of a this world ethics and what you should do here and now to benefit yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
the word that I can't remember which one you just used, but that I've come thriving, you said, but I've come across a lot is flourishing. That
Flourishing,
it's the,
eudaimonia, yeah.
yes,
Happiness also is
yes.
another translation for, yeah,
And
well-being. Mm-hmm.
it's necessary now as we kind of go through a history of ethics. Obviously, we can't cover every philosopher and
Mm-hmm.
every system that's ever been taught. So I just wanted to focus on the ones that came to my mind. And the next big innovation seemed to me to come from the Stoics, from the likes of Zeno and Cicero and Epictetus, for instance. How did the Stoics view and teach ethics?
Um, Very, very influenced by Socrates. This Cicero and Epictetus, Epicurus. A lot of these are about also the um, the soul, and the salvation of the soul is very prominent in their thinking also. But what's interesting about them is that the whole philosophy was about being calm in a world that wasn't calm. It became particularly important towards the decline of the Roman Empire, because the decline of the Roman Empire, because things were out of control. So if the world looks like it's out of control to you, then there's no sense in trying to fix it, because you can't do it. So the only thing is to focus on what you can control, and what you can control is your own power over your composure. You have to have certain kind of composure, and um, and Socrates was an ideal for the Stoics, precisely because he went to they bought into the legend created by Plato that he went to his death because he stood for truth, stood for justice, and went to his death very calmly. And he did go to his death. He had an opportunity to to leave the city, but he didn't. And then he had an opportunity to choose, to another opportunity to choose to leave rather than death. And then even after he was condemned to death and he was in jail, he had an opportunity to escape from jail and still didn't. So he was lionized as a man who stood for principle for the Stoics, and so that death was not something to fear at all, because of you have an immortal, if you have an immortal soul, that's sort of part of the soul of the universe itself. They were they didn't see like a one god, personal god. They were more inclined to be pantheists. They saw the divine as being immersed in the world itself, and that the soul of man was part of that divine that is immersed in the world. So if the world is sort of going to hell in a handbasket, you have to sit calmly and realize that there's nothing that you can do, but you can have control over your own state of mind. And
It
yeah,
seems like
depressing. It's a very depressing
yes,
moral
it seems to
philosophy.
me like with Aristotle we have a far more optimistic view. It's about happiness and flourishing and
Mhm,
pleasure,
mhm.
whereas with Plato and the Stoics we have this emphasis on unhappiness and not caving to your bodily desires or the flesh and
They're
that sort of thing.
very ascetic. Yeah, a very
Yes,
ascetic
that's a good
vision.
way to put it.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to jump ahead, I think maybe 12, 13, maybe 1400 years
Oh.
to Immanuel Kant.
Mhm.
And Immanuel Kant, his teaching was of a deontological ethics. So what does that mean? What was Kant's deontological ethics?
Well, it had it the triumph of Christianity had a lot to do with Kant. I mean, Kant's ethics is very Christian, but at the same time, Kant is also regarded as part of the rationalism of the Enlightenment. So so Kant doesn't talk about God in his ethics, but he talks about reason. You know, so that um, reason orders you to do certain things. I mean, you're governed by reason, and reason itself has the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is the moral law that's in your head. Okay? And that moral law commands you not to lie, not to kill, what not to do. It has the rules, but all the rules are the same rules, basically. And there's nothing eudaimonistic about them. It's the very opposite of understanding ethics as eudaimonia. It's the understanding ethics as absolute categorical rules, so that they don't involve if or but. They're deontological, not I forgot the opposite of deontological for now.
Teleological.
Yeah, they're not about ends at all. So the moral law says this is what you must do. No ifs or buts about it. Regardless of whether you want to do it, regardless of whatever ends you want to achieve, it's an ought that is a categorical ought. Whereas a teleological ought or a conditional ought is one that says if you want your tomatoes to thrive, then you ought to plant them after the last frost. Um, and that is a conditional ought. If you want to achieve this, and he doesn't think ethics is like that. It's not if you want to thrive, if you want to have a good life, then you should live a moral life. Uh, you should live an ethical life. So he rejects that view of ethics completely, and has this view that ethics is about reason, and reason is about um, is categorical and not teleological in any way.
Something just
Now,
occurred to me that
there's
I want to ask
something
you this.
crazy about it. Mm-hmm.
Is that with Plato, with the Stoics, with
Mm-hmm.
Kant, it's all very similar to Christian ethics. And
Yes.
I just wonder how much do these philosophers influence Christianity and how much does Christianity influence them? Obviously, with Plato and Socrates, they were hundreds of years before Christianity,
Mhm.
so the influence couldn't have gone there. But in regard to the later Stoics and Kant, do we have kind of a reciprocal causation where they influence Christianity, Christianity influences them, and it goes that direction? Is there even a connection? I guess is my
Oh,
question.
absolutely. I mean, the Orphic religions, they anticipate Christianity. They anticipate Christianity, uh, and I really don't think the legend of Socrates and the success of Plato and the triumph of Plato in the history of the West would have been possible without the success of Christianity. I mean, I argue in my book on Socrates that the whole legend of Socrates, the whole triumph of Socrates in history of Western thought, it was impossible without Christianity. And for the most part, it's really the self-congratulation. I mean, all of the love of Socrates, all of this idea that Socrates represent Western thought is ultimately the self-congratulation of triumphant ideas, historically triumphant, and the power of Christianity and the triumph of Christianity as part and parcel of the Western civilization and the power of it, and ultimately the tyranny of the Catholic Church. I mean, the 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 religion of Socrates was a religion that ultimately the Orphic religion had already deteriorated when Plato came along, when Plato was writing, and some of his interlocutors in the laws, knew that the Orphic religion had deteriorated, but Plato stuck to it anyways. The Orphic religion had deteriorated into, the sale of indulgences, which is exactly what happened to Catholicism until the Protestant Reformation. But Plato thought that these were useful myths, and this is what was to me so shocking, that these useful myths, he hung on to them anyways because he didn't really trust the argument about eudaimonia. That
He called it a great lie, right? In the Republic.
the great, yeah, the myth of metals, and there's lots of lies. He had lots of myths. All of the myths of Plato are Orphic myths. They're myths about the afterlife and the punishments and rewards of the afterlife. And then the guy has the nerve to say that Homer's myths are a bunch of lies and my myths are true myths, because deep down, the details might not be right, but deep down they have a deep truth to them. I mean, at least Homer's myths were about the real world, the world we actually know, that we experience. You don't have to believe in Zeus in order to experience the lightning and thunder. He was represented a natural phenomenon. You don't have to believe in Poseidon to experience the wildness of the sea. You don't have to believe in Demeter to experience the bountifulness uh, of the harvest. And you don't have to believe in Hades to experience, the sting of death, or in Aphrodite to experience the transport of erotic love. All of these are naturalistic myths about the world in which we live. That's how Homer and the tragic poets, they understood morality in the way that is much more profound than anything that Plato and all of his descendants, including the Christians, had to offer. Mhm.
Well, there were two philosophers. One came, I think, in the late 18th century, one in the early 19th. I might have my dates a little wrong, who definitely taught or emphasized effects in regard to morality. Very different from Aristotle, though. I'm talking about Jeremy Bentham and Auguste Comte. Can you tell us a little bit about each of them?
It's been too long since I've read Comte, but
Okay,
I
that's
will.
okay.
I can tell you about Bentham and John Stuart Mill and
Okay.
the Utilitarians. Um, Obviously, it's a reaction to Kant's idea that somehow that morality is totally categorical is a little bit ridiculous. I mean, he gives a and Kant gives the example of, well, you have a friend who's hiding out from some thugs that are chasing to kill him, and he's in your basement. Knock on the door. Is your friend here? You can't tell a lie. You have to. You cannot. Categorical imperative tells you. Your brain tells you that that doesn't make any sense. That only makes sense if this rational categorical imperative in your head is really God. Is really God. And and uh, philosophers like Elizabeth Anscombe, laughed at Kant, and rightly laughed at Kant. They said Kant does not make any sense unless there is God. And Elizabeth Anscombe thought that Aquinas was more rational because at least there was a God in his world that would make sense of something like a categorical imperative that says you do this or else. The alternative for you is death. And so anyways, the categorical imperative didn't make sense to her, and it doesn't make sense to me either. But I wouldn't I wouldn't join her in jumping over to Thomas Aquinas because I'm no great friend of Thomas Aquinas. I used to be, because there are some rational elements in Aquinas, but they all go to hell in a handbasket um, as soon as the church has power. Then it's all about crusades. It's all about natural justice when the infidels are in power. But when the church is in power, it's all about crusades and execution of witches and heretics and inquisition, etc. So uh, that my book on Aquinas was showing exactly, the hypocrisy of his theory of natural law, a theory that I actually admired at some point. But then when I did all the research on Aquinas, I discovered that the people who edit his work have edited all the dirty parts out. But if you go back to the Summa, the whole Summa, that's not edited by any Jesuits or edited by any um, Catholic scholars, then you see a very different Aquinas. But in any case, getting back to utilitarianism, utilitarianism was a kind of revolt against Kantian absolutism, if you want to call it that. And the utilitarians said, well, consequences have to be relevant for morality. So you can't say the consequences be damned, because that's what Kant is basically saying. The right, you have to do what is right, no matter what the consequences. It's absolute in that sense. It's categorical in that sense. The consequences are irrelevant, but the consequences aren't irrelevant for us in this world. They're very relevant of the consequences of our action. And so they talked in terms of consequences. I mean, Bentham basically said that the lawgiver has to have a great imagination and has to create rules and laws that would, if acted on, produce the best consequences for all sentient beings, not just for human beings, but for the animal world too, because they are capable of pain and pleasure. Um, so that was, and John Stuart Mill, you know, made quite a few adjustments and said, oh, well, actually, the idea of utilitarianism is to follow a route that enhances the growth and development of man as a progressive being. He thought it was a matter of progress, that man is in a state of progress, and that we have to look at progress. But I think neither the Kantian or the utilitarian view is self-sufficient in any way. Mm-hmm.
Both would ultimately, it seems to me, lead to the sacrificing of oneself. In the case of the duty ethics, for instance, I have to tell the robber the truth. If he comes to me and says, "Where's your money?" Oh, it's over here. I can't
Mm-hmm.
lie to him.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of utilitarianism, if we're going to maximize the happiness of everybody, if a case arises where my death or my own harm would benefit the most people, then that would be the ethical thing to do. So both seem to me to be, again, a difference from the Aristotelian perspective about the individual flourishing, happiness, living in the best life in this world, and ultimately devolve into some sort of a duty or a acting to benefit others at the expense of myself.
Well, ethics is not about benefiting oneself. It's about uh, what kind of a person you want to be, and that uh, one of my favorite, um, ethical tales is the Philoctetus by Sophocles, and in the Philoctetus, um, the Philoctetus was a fellow who had a terrible accident, and his leg was bleeding, and it was gangrened, and it was smelling terrible, but he was in possession of this magical bow that he was given by one of the gods. And the Greek army wanted the bow because it never missed, and they wanted the bow, but they didn't want him around. They didn't want a Philoctetus around because he smelled bad. And so they talked Achilles' son. They talked him into going to trick Philoctetus and get his bow from him, so that the army could use it. And of course, it was Odysseus, who's a very unscrupulous guy, who was doing this. And he so so Philoctetus does was a friend of I meant Philoctetus was a friend of Achilles' son, and Achilles' son just went and basically tricked him and got the bow. And then after he did that, he said, "No, I can't live with myself. I lied to him, and I tricked him, and I lied to him, and I can't stand it. I'd rather be dead than do that." So he went and confessed and returned the bow, and said he was sorry, and that he was going to make amends. He was going to take him to a city, and he was going to get his leg fixed or whatever he was going to do. And of course, he didn't care how he would suffer at the hands of the army, because they were probably going to kill him. And but he would rather take his lumps than do the ugly, terrible thing in order to save himself. And that was this idea of morality is not a sacrifice for somebody else. It's about what kind of a person that you are. That that,
Yeah, but
that
he wasn't a Kantian or a utilitarian.
no, no.
That what I'm saying is that in Kantianism, in utilitarianism, there's a situation can always arise where I have to sacrifice myself to either the noumenal version of reason that's issuing me
Mhm.
commands in the case
Yeah.
of Kant, or to the greater happiness of others in the case
Oh,
of
I see.
Bentham and Mill.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
Now, you said something a minute or so ago that's going to lead me to my next question. And you said that ethics is about the type of person you want to be. I
Yeah.
would differ a little, and I would say it's about the type of person that you should be. And
Hmm.
the reason is because wants ultimately can be very subjective. And that's my next question is, what is ethical subjectivism?
You're asking sort of if I'm saying that
No, no,
more
I'm not
like
asking if you're. I don't believe you're an ethical subjectivist. I could be wrong, but I'm not getting that. I'm just asking what it is.
what is ethical subjectivism?
Yes.
I'm not sure what you mean by it. Like, is it a subjective view of what is right?
Yes.
Hmm. Well, I really don't think there is such a thing, ethical subjectivism, because we all live in society. So either it's our standard comes from our society, or it comes from um, these newfangled people who tell us no, there is a universal absolute that's beyond what our society has to say. And it brings us right back to the issue we started with. The idea is there a difference between the community standard, the Sittlichkeit, that is grounded in a particular place at a particular time, on the one hand, or the universal, that difference between Sittlichkeit and Moralität that Hegel makes a very clear distinction of, between Sittlichkeit and Moralität. And definitely, Philoctetus, he's definitely part of a Sittlichkeit, a particular grounded morality. And there is a lot of contempt for grounded moralities that are grounded in particular societies, because thanks to Hegel, we believe in the, and thanks to Hegel, but also thanks to Christianity and Socrates and all of this whole tradition, is that there is something universal that is bigger and grander than the Sittlichkeit, and that the Sittlichkeit morality is what we call a um, a shame morality. That the reason that you don't want to do these things is because you will be shamed in your society, because you are departing from the standard of your society, and you will experience shame. And that the new morality, the more advanced morality that supposedly we've arrived to, the universal morality, is a guilt morality. This is why Socrates, for Plato, for Hegel, is a guy who discovers an I deep in his soul that is not a personal I. It's not an I that belongs to the society in which he lives. It's a universal I, and and that tells him that it. I find this universal I very, very dangerous, because it tells you that it doesn't matter what sacrifices are made, how many people you can destroy, how many societies you can destroy, etc., because it's such a small price to pay for the ultimate move forward, this move forward for all of humanity. And it's very similar to the way Marx thought, for example.
Yeah, you have to break
That
some omelets,
history
break some
itself.
eggs to make an omelet. But
Yeah.
what I mean is, there certainly are philosophers who have taught that there's no such thing as right and wrong, that it's
Oh,
just a matter of
well,
opinion. That's
they're immoralists, I would call it. Yeah,
okay. But that's
immoralists.
what I mean by
Yeah.
ethical subjectivism. Like
Mm.
in
Right and wrong
Nietzsche,
is all
for
in your
instance.
imagination,
Right.
or
There's no cognitive content to our moral conclusions. Even with what you said, I can't remember the word, the German word that Hegel used for localism and morality.
Sittlichkeit. Yeah,
That would be a cultural relativism, or an
yeah.
ethical relativism that's
Cultural
relative
relativism.
to
Yeah,
culture.
yeah,
But even in that case, you wouldn't have an objective sense of right and wrong. You would just have the cultural mores, the cultural norms that are dictating what is right and wrong
yes.
to a given community.
But they're not. They're there is a common denominator in all of them. Just the fact that you are living in a particular society, in a particular culture, doesn't mean that there is such a thing, I would say, as a natural law, a natural moral law, that is a common denominator to all the different Sittlichkeits, all the different culturally based moralities. Otherwise, there would be no basis for diplomacy in international relations. Be no basis for it at all. But we don't have to have one single view. So Herodotus really understands this very well. He said he did an experiment, or someone did an experiment, who brought different people from very different societies, and from one group that usually, like the Greeks, burn the bodies of their parents when they're dead. Another group, they eat the corpse of their parents when they're dead. And he asked the one group, uh, "What? How much money would you accept to burn your parents after their death instead of eating them? And they said, oh, horrors, horrors. We couldn't imagine doing something so terrible as burn our parents' bodies after they're dead. And then he brought the other group, the Greeks, and said, how much money would you accept in order to eat the corpses of your body, the corpses of your parents when they died? They said, horrors, horrors, we couldn't possibly do that. But these two look like they're miles apart. But in reality, they're not. They both want to do what they feel is most honorable or good for their parents after their death. So, yeah, the norms of society can be very different. But in the end, there are still common denominators common denominators like betraying a friend or something like that would strike me as a kind of common denominator. That sort of beneath contempt kind of thing.
See,
Um,
one issue that I have with the cultural relativist or ethical relativistic view of cultures is that, for instance, the ancient Greeks, pedophilia and homosexuality, or pedophilia,
mhm,
not homosexuality, because that's not a moral issue in my view, but the pedophilia was rampant. And if you, in Hindu culture, seti, where they burn alive the widow of people who die, is an accepted, of men who die, is an accepted practice. In Japan, in the day of the samurai, they would get a new sword and go out and kill somebody with it. You have to try out your new sword. In the slave holding South, it would have been seen as wrong to release slaves or to you know, help a slave get away. It would have been seen as wrong. And I don't know how an ethical relativistic view can survive that. If you're going to say that there is an objective morality, I don't think it can countenance those dynamics in given cultures.
um, it, I think there are a lot of weird or bad stuff that goes on in different cultures that are accepted because it's kind of the norm. But one of the interesting things about the world that we live in now, there's more international uh, kind of exchange all the time. I think that some of these, less than appetizing um, cultural trends are ultimately going to disappear because um, people, because they're laughable, they're kind of laughable, and people can only withstand so much ridicule, and you can see it with English dueling, for example. It was absolutely ridiculous English dueling because somebody insults you and you say, okay, let's have a duel. But the duel doesn't decide who was whose insult, what the truth is never revealed by the duel. It's just arbitrary. Someone is going to be killed. And
Right.
so English dueling, kind of has gone the way in which sati has gone also. But I think the best way to deal with uh, different cultural norms is not war, but
Oh, I don't think so
laughter,
either. But like,
comedy.
you refer to them as less appetizing, and
Mhm.
that ultimately illustrates my point is that there has to be a standard beyond culture in which to assess the various cultures and what is less appetizing, as you put it, within the various cultures, or what's laughable in a culture, or the truth, as you said in the case of dueling.
Mhm.
You can't just rely on that culture and say it's okay. There has to be some standard beyond it.
No, I'm not a cultural
Okay.
relativist, but I'm also not an absolutist that there is one true standard of justice that is because usually if there is one true standard of justice, it's always going to be our standard, you know. and that we have to convert everyone to our standard. This is how, American imperialism operates. We have to give democracy to everybody. We have to, shoot them and kill them until they get democracy, and then we're doing them a favor. That's just an excuse for imperialism. So I think more dialogue is more interesting, more interesting, and because ultimately no one has it all correct. No one's got all the right things, and an exchange of ideas and is the best way to start to see the silliness of your own society. And that's why I think comedy is better sometimes than philosophy. You know, yeah.
Well, Professor Drury, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. Where can people find you, and where can they find your books and your articles?
Uh, my my book on Socrates is this
Oh,
one
that's
is
great.
called "The Bleak Political Implications of Socratic Religion," and that was published in 2017. These are my two most recent books, and the very recent one is "Chauvinism of the West: The Case of American Exceptionalism," and it's about American foreign policy on the right and the left, the liberals and the or Democrats on one hand and the Republicans on the other. And I challenge both of them. So thank you so much, Michael. It
Thank you
was
very much.
it was fun talking to you.
You have a great day.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Till next time.